Okay, sorry, 1 second. So hopefully you can see me there.
Okay, so next speaker is Brian Flynn from the University of Bristol. Welcome, Brian.
Thanks, Juani. So yeah, so I'm Brian from the University of Bristol. I'm from Cat Labs here. The title of my talk is Learning Models of Quantum Systems from Experiments. Actually, a sort of broader title, the bigger topic is this quantum model learning agent, which is the algorithm that we describe in that paper. So if you enjoy the talk, I do invite you to check out that archive post. So obviously this is a sort of strange format for a talk in that I can't see you and you can't see each other, but it does give me one main advantage, and that is that I get to decide who you are as the listener. So for the purpose of this talk, you're going to be some scientist, you're in your lab, this is you, and in your lab you've got some mysterious quantum system, let's say this thing over here. Now the problem is your quantum system just isn't behaving the way you expected it would. Maybe this is some experiment you've been working on, or maybe it's a device you paid a lot of money for, but it just isn't doing what it said it would on the tin. So what you'd really like is to be able to look inside your quantum system to understand what interactions are going on and to help you sort of get it back on track. As we know, this is quite a sort of difficult challenge with these sort of delicate quantum systems. So this talk is about our attempt to address that exact problem, to give you a tool to inspect your quantum system's internal workings. So the last thing to say about you as the listener is, because you're a cartoon scientist, you don't really want to see too much maths in this talk. In fact, you'd much rather that I explain everything through cartoons. So that's what I'm going to try and do. If you do prefer to see maths, again, I invite you to look at the paper, and there's all the detail in there you could ever want. And I'll be on Slack all afternoon and happy to talk about the more detailed stuff in the Q&A afterwards. So to set the scene a bit more, so quantum model learning agent, just what is it as an overview? It's a machine learning protocol that distills the model that underlies some quantum system. So it does that by inferring which Hamiltonian seems to best match the system that you have. The result that it then gives you is a Hamiltonian model, which has these interactions that your system is subject to baked into it. This might allow you as a physicist to extract some insight on what is happening at the quantum level, which might be useful, for instance, if you're trying to realign your experiment or to verify that it does what you told your investors it would do. So now that we've met me and we've met you, the other characters in this, so I just want to introduce a few people. This is Raf Santagatti and Andrea Gentile. The three of us have been working on this for the last couple of years, along with a lot of help from all these other people. I won't name them all, but we're all very excited to finally be able to share this work. To give you a quick idea of the structure of the talk, I'm going to dwell for a second on some sort of background that's probably familiar to most of you, just to get all the language on the table that I'm going to use. Then I'm going to, again, talk about quantum Hamiltonian learning, which is another algorithm. This is not an algorithm that we've designed or that I'm presenting as new work, but it's important to understand the later sections. Then the quantum model learning agent, finally, this is our protocol, and I'll explain all the steps of it one by one there. And then finally, we'll sort of talk about the experimental study that we applied and that we wrote about in our recent paper. So as I say, a quick flight through the background just to get all the language on the table that I'm going to sort of rely on. So that quantum system we saw in your lab, I'm going to describe that with some state vector, call it psi. And we know that any quantum state is going to evolve according to its natural Hamiltonian. Now I've written the Hamiltonian as H0, this red object, you'll see that throughout the talk. And the evolution at a given time, your state is going to be in this state psi of t, which we call, which is calculated by this exponential of minus I H0 t. So this is what I call unitary time dynamics, and I'm going to use that a few times through the talk. But by sort of definition, this is an exponential calculation of a matrix, and we know that that's not scalable, right? So if you handed me a quantum computer tomorrow, I would plug it in replacement of my unitary time evolution, but that's all that would change with this algorithm, and that's where you'd get your speed up. And I'm not really going to dwell too much on that for the rest of the talk. What else about your quantum system that is important is that if I was to measure it in some basis that I get to decide, I would be able to get some estimation of its expectation value at a given time t. Then if I simply scan over t, I can sort of draw the dynamics that I would expect across a range of t. Okay, so we've seen now the background. As I say, the next thing to look into is quantum Hamiltonian learning, or QHL, I'll probably say. Again, this is not a new algorithm. This has been around a couple of years. So here's some sort of seminal papers. But I just want to get everyone on the same page to start off. So the big idea here is that if you can write down your H naught entirely, you've characterized your system, which means you can make predictions about what it will do at any value of time. And clearly that's quite a powerful thing to be able to do. Terms inside that Hamiltonian will give you some sort of physical interactions. So the example I'm going to start off with is going to be this basic Pauli Y operator. And I've assigned this parameter in front of this omega. And you might, if I was able to learn that omega, I would get some physical insight, in this case, the Rabi frequency. So the entire game of QHL is we want to learn these parameters, that omega in this case. And that would allow us then to reproduce the dynamics that we're targeting. I should just point one thing out. For the time being, you're looking at simulated data with these red dots, and I'll flag when we move to real system data. So how am I going to do QHL? I'm going to start off by writing down what I do know about omega. So I shouldn't know too much. I don't want to give myself too many advantages, but let's say I know in advance the order of magnitude, and it lets me write down, say, initially that's between 0 and 10 megahertz, and I write it down in this sort of Gaussian distribution. So what I've got here is a probability distribution, or if you like, because we're in a sort of Bayesian framework, I can think of this as my belief that each parameter is the correct parameter. And what we're sort of looking for here is that the red dotted line is in fact the target parameter we're shooting for. What I can do now that I have a probability distribution, I'm going to sample from it. And then for that sample, that lets me compute an expectation value, assuming that was the value of omega. But now, because I know my red dots in advance, I know what the system actually had, the true H naught system had for that value of time. So that lets me compare my sampled point with the true expectation value. So if the comparison is favorable, I'm going to push up my belief on that value of omega that I sampled. And if it was unfavorable, I'm going to push that down. So it lets me redraw my probability distribution. And I might sample, say, 1,000 points in this probability distribution so that I can redraw, bringing with me the information I gained from all of those samples. So if you're familiar with machine learning, this might look familiar. This is just standard Bayesian inference. So you might have seen this a bit before. And then I'm going to repeat that sampling procedure, say 100 times, to sort of continuously improve my belief about omega. So let's see what happens. Then I start off with that wide distribution, and through sampling and redrawing my probability or my belief, I sort of converge to the correct value over time. And what I want to point out about this is that you'll see two things. Firstly, you'll see the mean of that distribution, the average, moves towards the correct value sort of reasonably quickly. But importantly as well, the width of the distribution sort of thins at the same time. So I'm improving my estimate of the parameter, and I'm also improving on the uncertainty I have about that estimate. So just to put it into a single plot, you can see here my parameter estimate converging, and you can see the width, my uncertainty converging as well. And that lets me sort of redraw the dynamics reasonably well. I hope you'll agree. Okay, so that's QHL in a nutshell. But supposing I want to make the game a bit harder on myself. So this was quite a straightforward system with quite straightforward dynamics. Let's make things a little bit harder. So I'm going to start now with a much more complicated Hamiltonian. This time I've got 6 operators in it. I've got all my Pauli operators, these S's, but I've also added in some interactions, say with another particle or with the environment. What's interesting is it doesn't actually matter what you put in your Hamiltonian. The important thing was that I was able to write it down in advance. And each operator has a parameter in front. That's the important thing. Then I do the exact same thing. I write down the knowledge that I had on each of those parameters in advance. I sample from now my 6-dimensional probability distribution. And then I redraw my probability distribution and just iterate that procedure. That lets me learn 6 parameters at the same time now. And that lets me sort of reproduce my dynamics. And this time, I think you'll agree it looks quite well for what are actually quite intricate dynamics. So as I say, that's quantum Hamiltonian learning. Not a new procedure, but we're going to use it a bit now. So the quantum model learning agent, to move on, the sort of natural next question you might have would be to say, well, what if I didn't know which model best described my system in advance? I wasn't able to describe H like that in advance. And you know, different physical systems have different interactions. They give you different operators in your Hamiltonian, so you get a completely different model. So QMLA is going to try and learn what terms or what operators are in your best representative model. So I'm going to start a bit behind, and we'll come into QMLA in a second. So I'm going to start again with these sort of rich dynamics, these rich complicated dynamics. And I've got this sort of, I'm going to call this my true model. Again, this is a simulation. And I've assigned this character here. If you know who this is, it might help keep you awake. If you don't like these cartoons along the side, you can try and ignore them. It shouldn't affect anything I say. So I started with my sort of 6-parameter true model. And I hope that what's clear is that there's nothing stopping me from coming along with any model and trying to explain these red dots. So I'm going to come along now with my Pauli Z model this time and say, okay, Pauli Z, you do your best and try to explain those red dots. But as we probably saw a bit earlier, Pauli Z is quite a basic operator, and it's probably never going to capture any interesting dynamics like that. The best it's going to do is sort of oscillate up and down and miss the sort of interesting stuff in the middle, right? So in other words, the physics that Pauli Z sort of tells you about can never describe the more interesting physics that this Hamiltonian corresponds to. Okay, so then let's try a more complicated model. So now I move to this sort of 4-operator Hamiltonian. And I'm going to say to this instead, okay, now you try and explain these dynamics as best as you can. And then I perform QHL, and we see the output when I reproduce the dynamics, and I hope you'll agree it looks a lot better. So it's not getting it perfectly, right? So certainly later on, it's missing some of these high peaks. But it's at least getting the frequency between the peaks, and early on it's pretty much perfect. So even though it's not the complete model I've quantum Hamiltonian learned, if you like, I'm certainly getting some insight on the physics from what I have reproduced. Okay, so perfect. So now what I need is some way to say more systematically, you know, it's quite clear to you and me looking at this plot that this sort of green model does a lot better at explaining the red dots than the blue model does. And I'd like to be able to use that insight to sort of improve my guess at the model. So what I need to be able to do is fight these models against each other in such a way that I can actually construct meaningful models going forward. So let's try and do that a bit more systematically. So the last concept I'm going to introduce is this one of Bayes factors. Now, Bayes factors is exactly what I just said. It's just a number that tells you how much you can believe one model is better than another at explaining red dots, okay? So in this case, all it's telling me is that my green H2 model was 10 to the 10 times better than my blue H1 at explaining these red dots underneath, if you can still see them. If you actually care for the details, what I'm actually doing is taking the ratio of the sum of their log likelihoods of those two models. But if you don't care, this is just a number that tells me I preferred Bulbasaur over Squirtle in this case. Okay, so perfect. So you might be thinking, this is easy, right? All you got to do is learn all the models that there are. Then I can compare them all through Bayes factors and then just pick my favorite out the other end. But then you sort of start to think a little bit and you say, well, hang on, how many models is there? And you think, okay, right, well, for sort of 1 qubit, you know, there's just the Pauli operators. I can maybe add them together, but there's not too many. I can write them all down at least. But then you think, okay, right, what about 2 qubit systems? Suddenly I can tensor product these things together, or I can add them together, or I can add together tensor products. And it starts to get a bit, you know, a bit out of hand. And if you think about higher and higher dimensions, 3, 4, 5 qubits, this thing starts to explode. In actual fact, you're in an exponential model space. And as I told you at the very start about the QHL, to do QHL, what you actually need to do is 1,000 samples, each one doing this unitary evolution, which was an exponential calculation. Remember at the start, the unitary time evolution. So now you're in an exponential model space of thousands of exponential calculations. Now you need 2 quantum computers, right? We need to do a little bit better than that. So what we want to actually do, the full game, is we're going to try and learn somehow an efficient subset of the entire model space. Okay, so then the very next question should be, well, which subset? So supposing I don't know which models or which subset to try, there's this entire zoo of models available to me. Where do I start? Okay, so finally we're at the point where I'm ready to go through the QMLA protocol in all of its steps. All of that was sort of motivation or to set the scene for what I'm about to say. And the idea again is we're going to iteratively learn the terms that are present in H0. We're going to do that by learning individual models through QHL and distinguishing those models through their Bayes factors. So the protocol, I'm going to go through the protocol twice just so that's clear. So we're going to start with a basic set of models. And in this case, you can think of these as, say, the Pauli operators as something similar, right? So you got 3 models in this case. Let's call it a branch. And what I can do is I can perform QHL on each model in here. Then I can compare them with Bayes factors sort of one-on-one, which lets me sort of choose a branch champion out of this set that I started with. The next thing I'm going to do, once I have my branch champion, I'm going to generate another set of models. But the important thing is I'm going to bring with me the knowledge that I gained from this branch. So the next set of models are going to bring the properties along with them. So the physics I learn here, I bring to the next branch with me. Then all I have to do is sort of iterate, and at the end, pick my sort of global champion, if you like, the one that I believe best describes my system. Okay, so let me go through that again, maybe a bit more scientifically. So I have a layer of models, say, to start off with, or nearly at any point in the middle of the algorithm, I have a layer of models. Each purple dot in this layer corresponds to a different model. Each model is a Hamiltonian, which is just a sum of operators, and each operator corresponds or is assigned a unique parameter. And each operator corresponds to some physical interaction you care about. So then every model in your layer, you feed into your sort of QHL engine so that you can learn the parameters of that model as well as possible, given its constraints. So now that you've learned the parameters of the model, you can take Bayes factors between them and sort of consolidate that layer or that branch so that you can pick your favorite within the branch. Now that you have your branch champion, you just have to generate another set of models which inherit its physical properties. Okay, so you have a branch, QHL on all the models, Bayes factors between them, pick your favorite and spawn. And that's the entire algorithm, okay? So it's really as simple as that. Okay, so just to sort of wrap up, I wanted to talk about the experiment that we actually performed and that we write about in the paper. For the experimentalists among us, what we did was we took an electron spin in an NV center. This is called Han echo sequence. I think this is nothing probably surprising for any experimentalist, but just to give you an idea. So what you do is you prepare your electron spin in 0 state, apply a pi/2 shift. And the important part here is that we allow the system to evolve according to its own Hamiltonian for a time t. This is the thing we're trying to sort of probe and understand. Then we do another pi shift, another evolution, and we finally project onto plus over there. So if you don't really care about the experimental details, all you really care about is that this gives you another set of red dots that you can use to play the QMLA game with. So what I'm going to do, the exact protocol I just outlined, I'm going to start off with my basic Pauli operators, S, X, Y, and Z, do QHL on all of those. These connections here are the Bayes factors between these models. And then I pick a sort of favorite of this first branch. And then I generate another set of model which inherits that physics. Do the same QHL on each of these, pick a favorite, spawn, and do that the whole way down. So what you'll see is that at each layer, I'm nominating a sort of branch champion or a layer champion in this sort of light orange color. And at the end, I just compare my branch champions so that I'm comparing a sort of efficient subset so that I don't have like a fully connected graph effectively. So what do I want to point out? At the very end then, you choose your global champion from your branch champions. In this case, it's chosen this one here. What's interesting about this is that this model is somehow in like the middle of the tree. It's not too far down. What's interesting about that is that if you look closely at the later models, they've all got all of the same terms in them plus more, right? As the one that ultimately wins. So what I'm saying is I've given it every opportunity to overfit, but QMLA doesn't want to. QMLA pulls you back to the simplest model that can describe your system, which is quite powerful. It means you're not going to overgeneralize and you're not going to see interactions or interpret interactions that aren't really there, hopefully. Okay, so the last thing to point out is that if you think quite hard about it, nearly every step I sort of talked about was sort of probabilistic. So you probably don't want to rely on a single run of QMLA. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run it 100 times and take statistics instead. So indeed doing that and independent QMLA runs. And what I'm showing here is how many times a given model wins the game. And yeah, so we see that this model here sort of is the outright winner in the experiment. But I want to look for a second at the ones that come second and third, the next sort of 20 and 30% of models. So what's important is that they're very, very similar models. There may be one term off. So the algorithm has gone a little bit off because of the probabilistic nature. But the important thing is that the models it tells you out the other end will give you much of the same physical insight you would have got if you'd got, say, exactly the underlying model. The thing then you care about at the very end is your sanity check of how does it do at reproducing the red dots, right? That's what you as a human can look at and say, okay, I trust this model is predictive, has got strong predictive power. So here's the champion model's attempt at explaining the red dots, and I hope you'll agree it does quite well at what are quite tricky dynamics. So I think I'm just about nearly on time. So let me just summarize, and I'll say, if you started off with a model and you describe and you learned its parameters, that was quantum Hamiltonian learning. If instead you were finding the underlying Hamiltonian, then what you did was quantum model learning, the quantum model learning agent. That's the new part. Now it's important to draw that distinction. And very lastly, so one thing that I didn't really say yet is that all of this has been wrapped together into a single Python package. We're going to make that available soon. Maybe if you think this is interesting or you might like to give it a try, get in touch. We might be able to get it to you ahead of release. But I think that's pretty much everything for me. So thank you very much for your time. I don't know if Juani's still there somewhere. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Yes, I'm here. I thank the speaker. We have 4 minutes for questions, more or less. I'm gonna go quickly over some questions that the audience has asked. Katerina Viggilar says, fantastic talk. Wants to know more about how you span new models from your champion. Could you say something more about your inheritance rule?
Absolutely. Yeah, so yeah. I sort of purposely glossed over this point, but it's a really important point. So if I just go back 1 or 2 slides. Oops. Okay, so say from here, you've picked your champion and you want to spawn the new models. The reason I didn't actually go into too much detail is because the algorithm itself allows you as the user to decide how you spawn the models. So, so when we release the Python package, the point is that any user with any system they have will be able to come in and decide those spawn rules themselves to match, say, the physics that they have in their lab. Now, in our case, what we actually did was we just added, we use a sort of greedy rule where we sort of add these Pauli terms greedily. So you see here, this was the SY model. The next models are just SX plus SY and then SY plus SZ. So all I'm doing is saying the models that didn't win in the last branch, consider them again. And you do that greedily until you run out of models. And then you pull in another basket of models and start adding them one by one again. So what we're doing is that sort of basic greedy approach in this paper, but the algorithm itself is more general and allows you to do anything you want. So one quick thing to say about that is what we're looking at is things like maybe genetic algorithms to maybe combine models in more clever ways, might be able to do that and get you more complicated systems, for instance, than the one we studied.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to go to another question. Alex Clark asks if it's possible to learn Hamiltonians with coefficients that change with time.
Yeah, in principle it is. We have. I haven't really done it. I've had a quick look at it. Yeah, so the short answer is in principle, I think so.
Okay, thanks. Research show, well, actually is your method of determining a global champion through comparisons of bias factors from branch champions a way of coping with potential overfitting?
It is, sorry, absolutely. So yeah, so in this case, the plot I still have here, I've picked branch champions at every layer and I've sort of gone 9 layers deep. And then as Reese points out, I do sort of compute Bayes factors between these branch champions, just in case that by adding terms I've actually made it more complicated than it needs to be. So it is to pull me back from overfitting in that sense. And the Bayes factors look after that for you as a tool. It doesn't like overfitting models generally. So yeah, I think Reese is right about that.
Do your results depend on time? How does time reflect on your accuracy?
Sorry, could you say that again?
Moylet.
Could you say that again?
Alexandra Moylet asks whether the time of the experiments affects the accuracy you get.
Oh, absolutely. So again, another thing I swept under the rug is that the QHL protocol that we sort of rely on is in charge of designing the experiments that it runs. So the rate that it learns at, that it converges the parameters at, it's in charge of deciding the next experiment so that it can maximize the information it gains. So for instance, if you've got quite complicated dynamics and you've got like a large amount of uncertainty in your parameters, you're probably not going to be able to predict, you know, t is equal to 100 microseconds off the bat, because you'll probably be way too wrong in too many respects. So when you've got like a high level of
Thank you, Brian.
Sorry.
Thanks. We need to change to the next speaker.
Okay.
Sorry to cut you.
Yeah.
So thank you, Brian, for everything. And there is a couple of questions we'll move to Slack in the stream.
Okay, thanks a lot.